Interest rates have been skyrocketing recently because the Federal Reserve is not blinking in the face of struggling Americans. They're trying to crush the inflation monster regardless of how many 401ks they destroy along the way. This means that mortgage rates are going up, car loan rates are going up, credit card rates are going up, and key here, the United States government debt's interest rates are going up. But it's not as you might think, because that's making many people ask the question, how high can interest rates go before the federal government defaults and can't pay their bills? Well, the answer is really a different question. The question is not how high can interest rates go, but how long can interest rates stay high? Ready? Let's dive in. So the proper question to ask is, how long can interest rates stay high before the government has a problem? Why is that the correct question? Well, first of all, interest rates could go to 20%. Let's say the Federal Reserve tomorrow came out and said, hey, surprise interest rate hike, we're going up to 20%. What would that do to the federal government's expenses? Absolutely nothing. Why is that? Well, because they already have $30 trillion worth of debt at the interest rates that they got that debt at. And so it's just like if you get a mortgage, if you bought a house 6 months ago, a year ago, it doesn't matter what mortgage rates do today, has nothing to do with your fixed rate mortgage. You're still going to pay what you were always going to pay on that. So as long as you can afford that mortgage, you're not going to be forced out of your house, regardless of what housing prices do or mortgage rates do. Has nothing to do with you. Same thing for the government. They've got $30 trillion worth of debt. It doesn't matter what interest rates do on the open market today for their $30 trillion pile. But what does matter is when they roll it over. So let's say you've got a credit card with $20,000 on it and you can't pay it off. And every month you add a little bit to it. You add $1,000 to it every single month, let's say. So every month it goes from $20,000, $21,000, $22,000. You just keep on loading it up. That means you're spending more than you're bringing in. That's what the federal government does. They continue to spend more. Well, every month you also have a bill. You have to pay that minimum payment, and that includes some interest cost. That's what the federal government has to do every time some of that debt matures. Now, they've got a huge pile, $30 trillion. Some of that is 30-year debt. It matures in 30 years. Some of that is like 1 month, 5 months, a year. Some of it's very short term. On average, it's just about 5 years. So if interest rates, let's say, go up to 20%, initially, that does nothing to them. It has no bearing whatsoever. But every time they have to pay back some debt, they're not paying that debt back from a surplus of income. It's like you with your credit card. You're paying that, but you're using, let's say, a different credit card to make up your expenses. And so they're borrowing more to pay off that old debt. So every time they borrow more to pay off that old debt, they borrow from Aunt Sally to pay back Uncle John, what they're doing is getting a little bit higher and higher average interest rate on their debt. And slowly over time, the interest cost will rise as they borrow new debt at the higher interest rate to pay off that old debt at the lower interest rate. Now, I mentioned the average maturity of their debt is about 5 years, and this is key and one of the things that will protect the government from default, because knowing that they could survive 5 years potentially before it gets to the point where all of their debt is at that higher interest rate, or meaningfully enough of it is at that higher interest rate to cause a problem, would mean that the market might be willing to lend to the government below 20%. Now, if the Fed funds rate is at 20%, which is the one that the Federal Reserve controls, why in the world would the rest of the yield curve, like the 10-year Treasury, the 20-year Treasury, the 30-year Treasury, why would they be below that? And I'm not talking about manipulation here. I'm talking about a free market, rational response. Well, there are two reasons for this. Number one, you might be looking at a federal funds rate of 20% and thinking, that's overdoing it, Federal Reserve. You're going to cause a major crash here. And you might be thinking rationally that that's going to cause a bunch of companies to default, a bunch of layoffs, a bunch of crashes of all sorts of markets, whether it's housing and crypto and stocks and everything. It's going to come all tumbling down. You might see just a huge Great Depression, the new Great Depression on the horizon as a result of interest rates that high. Now, What do you think that means for inflation? Well, it means inflation is going to disappear like that because we're going to have some major deflation. Prices are just going to collapse, prices of everything. Nobody will be able to afford anything. And if prices are collapsing, even a 0% return, assuming you get your capital back, is a positive return. Because as long as you maintain your purchasing power, everything else crashed. That means you gained in purchasing power relative to everything else. That's why in inflation, cash is trash, but in deflation, cash is king, because cash goes down in value during inflation and up in value during deflation. When everything's popping, cash is trash. When everything's dropping, cash is king. So if I can lend to the government at 5%, I'm going to do that. If I can lend to the government at 4%, I'm going to do that. If I can lend to the government at 1%, I'm going to do that, because that's still better than literally everything else, which is going down in value. And so if the Federal Reserve tries to jack up interest rates, let's say to 20%, it probably wouldn't do that to the rest of the curve. The United States government would probably still be able to borrow at rates well below the federal funds rate, because rational market actors would be looking at that and thinking the crash will be so severe that I'm willing to lend to the government at 3%, because that's going to be way better than the return on anything else. It'll actually be positive and everything else will be negative, and then I'll get to scoop up other things at a deep discount at maturity, which means that the Federal Reserve keeps on jacking interest rates up higher. It's very possible that it has diminishing effect on United States Treasury debt going up in interest rates, which means that the United States government might not be at risk of defaulting on its debt from high interest rates anytime soon. Because the higher rates go, the more problems the economy might have, meaning that lower interest rates for the government would become more and more attractive. Now, there are plenty of other problems here that the United States government is facing, such as the size of its debt, the holdings of its debt that the rest of the world has, the dollar going up, the rest of the world dumping those treasuries. There's a huge amount of problems that the United States government is facing, not even to mention unfunded liabilities, but rising interest rates, at least right now, and at least for the next few years, pose no risk to the US government. That's one thing that, fortunately, we don't have to worry about, at least not yet. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.